All right, let's get started. Welcome to another edition of the Risk-Can Compound Events webinar series. So very nice to see a bunch of people for what I think will be a pretty exciting set of talks. And yeah, we'll try to, unlike some fire editions that have run very long, I think we'll try to keep it to, an hour and 15 minutes. Just to the sake of everyone's time, and that seems to be about the time when people have to start leaving for other things anyway. So I will not follow my own kind of instructions and just kind of show this PowerPoint introduction, not in full screen, so I can see everything that's going on. Yeah, so today's webinar will have two speakers in reverse order from the listing here. So first we'll have Greg Yetman from Columbia, and then we'll have Anaïs Couasnon from VU Amsterdam. And Anaïs, I'm not sure if you're, Anaïs's title might be slightly different than this, but that's the general topic. And in terms of announcements, so these are some other events that are happening. And as always, we have a Google Sheets page you can check. But everything that is important either shows up here or in the newsletters, which we periodically send out, or both. And I also wanted to spend a minute also to highlight, and maybe Kai has another comment on this as well, or maybe not, but on July 27th, I think, that Wednesday of the last week of July, we're going to be doing an event that we haven't done before, which I think should be, well, is intended to benefit early career researchers especially, and that's to talk about proposals, kind of how to approach proposals, what ideas are more and less valuable, I guess, and basically have a peer critique of proposal writing, and sharing knowledge about proposal opportunities. So it's supposed to be a casual and friendly kind of helping each other, peer resource kind of thing. And in the poll we did recently, that was one of the most popular ideas for activities that we can do as a networking group, because after all, our name is networking, and so we're supposed to try to lift each other up. Yeah, so I maybe didn't describe that as smoothly as it could have been, but yeah, please see the email from a few days ago for a more detailed description, and I guess we'll put something on this living Google Sheets page as well. So please, make a note of that if you are interested in attending, and then yeah, and prepare a couple, like a paragraph or two of some idea, and then we'll kind of meet in small groups and think about each other's ideas, just in the level of, this is what I like, this is what could be expanded on, that kind of thing. All right, so yeah, and then also just to highlight, Kai and I are involved in this Como training school on compound events, and the application deadline is coming up. So take a look at that as well if you might be interested.
Yeah, and I pasted the event webpage in the chat. So feel free to have a look and spread this among your early career researcher colleagues, PhDs, early postdocs. It's really a fantastic opportunity at a really fascinating location, and the program can be seen there as well. You'll see a couple of colleagues, the organizing committee, and also as lecturers. So really a fantastic event.
All right, and then with that, we will start the talks for today. So first we'll have Greg Yetman, who volunteered to introduce himself in an unprecedented act of generosity. So thanks, Greg, and really looking forward to your talk.
Greg, you're on mute, I think. being on mute makes it difficult. So I've shared my screen. Hopefully you see my title slide.
Yes, that's good.
Great, thanks. I'm Associate Director for Geospatial Applications at CSEN, which is a research center on the Lamont campus of Columbia University, part of the Columbia Climate School. And today I'm going to talk a little bit of a hodgepodge about some of our past multi-hazard research efforts, some data and data issues, and then a little bit on our current work and future plans. So I'll dive right in. So when you look at the literature, earlier studies looking at multiple hazards tend to see them as independent events, not coincident in time, and talk about hazard impacts on development, fits with the poverty trap model, as it was often called, and was useful for economic development and planning. And this has changed over the years as we look at cascading hazards, and not through my active research, but just looking at the research in general, you see a change in how this is viewed, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. But I'm going to go back in time and talk about the Global Natural Disaster Hotspot study we did that was released in 2004, just before the Indonesian tsunami that put hazards at the top of mind for everybody. And it was funded by the World Bank, and it was a joint effort with a lot of different centers and researchers at Columbia and partners, external partners as well. And it actually won an award, a Good Practice Award at the World Bank, and it was used extensively. Mostly they used the spreadsheet that came along with it that talked about countries and the different disasters that occurred in the different countries. But I'm just going to highlight what we did for multiple hazards, starting with a quick look. Indonesia, top of mind. We took hazard probabilities. We could only find a global subnational probability surface for one or two hazards. Almost everything was either occurrence or index. So good subnational detailed probability layers just were not available. And this has changed for some of the hazards, and there's more hazards to consider now. For instance, I was at the planning meeting where we talked about including tsunamis in the in the hazard in the analysis, and decided to exclude it in part because of a lack of data on occurrence, which, having the report released just before the Asian tsunami put it top of mind was I don't know if that was a stroke of good fortune or bad luck, but anyway, so we took these generally occurrence layers, except for landslides, which was an index, and just ranked them into deciles. So we had from top to bottom, the top three deciles were the ones we were most concerned with. We just looked at the areas that were most likely to experience extreme events based on historic occurrence. And then we had just two factors for exposure. We had population and mortality counts by disaster type by region from the MDOT database, which is a database that tracks large disasters and gives mortality counts, and economic impacts, again, from the MDOT data. So we've got rates of mortality and economic impacts for each of the 6 disasters. And then we just mapped out the areas that are the highest top 3 deciles of impact, and combined that with the mortality data and the economic data. And that gives us a look at mortality from all causes, so multiple hazards from all, and GDP impacted by all disasters. Typically, we show this as a proportion rather than total GDP, which is a good way to normalize it, because if it's a higher proportion of a country's GDP rather than just total number, when you're comparing global data, it makes a lot more sense. And we got these, interesting subnational, for the first time, maps of vulnerability exposure, I should say, from multiple disasters. And these were aggregated up. Like I said, it was really common for folks at the World Bank to be using the spreadsheet that aggregated these disasters and the rankings by country. But it also didn't tell us things we really didn't know. I mean, to say that Indonesia is at high risk from multiple disasters is not a earth-shattering statement, or the Philippines, or parts of Mexico, or parts of Japan, the south coast of China, from these 6 disasters. It was pretty typical, but it was nice to see it all put together. So here we had areas of high risk based on mortality from grouped hazards. So we're looking at drought, geophysical, water-related, or combinations thereof. And no big surprise here either. The largest, greater than half of the mortality in the MDOT data that we assembled for the time period was from drought in Africa, right? So just in terms of raw numbers of casualties. And when you look at straight economic impact, you see, the United States really jumps out. Pretty much all of Europe jumps out as high impact, but this is just straight up GDP. So it's a matter of exposure, because high GDP means high exposure to these multiple floods. But more relevant is when you look at the proportional GDP impact, and then you see, Indonesia, the Philippines, areas in the Middle East that really jump out with proportional impact from multiple hazards. And so this study is, a bit long in the tooth now, published in 2004, but we still get references and requests for the data, and it's an interesting look at multiple hazards, but again, considered as independent events. And my video froze for a moment, but hopefully everybody can still hear me.
Yeah, everything seems good for me.
Okay, cool. Just froze on my end, probably. Good. So a couple of extreme examples that we haven't studied, but just when talking about multiple hazards, you jump to this extreme example. So the Banda Islands in Indonesia, this is a pretty extreme one. There was an earthquake, tsunami, volcanic eruption, and typhoon all on the same day in 1778. And the Banda Islands is I believe one of the set of islands that was traded for Manhattan because of the nutmeg that was from there. It was considered valuable. So between the Dutch and the English traded the island of Manhattan. And then another more recent example that's pretty catastrophic as well is looking at Mount Pinatubo eruption in 1991, the same day that a typhoon made landfall. And the impacts, the power outages, and even mortality rates were considered to be greater in part because of the typhoon, which kept a lot of the ash from streaming, offshore, and the rainfall pulled out of the air, and more ash fell in populated areas because of the typhoon, according to the Joint Typhoon Warning Center in the area. So these types of extreme events seem pretty low probability, but they do occur if you start searching around. There's more examples of this, but they're very difficult to plan for. But they are scenario-based things that we should look at. To look at the framework of hazard interactions and cascading hazard events, how it's changed. I suspect this is old hat for folks on the call, but traditional disaster management, with the 4 phases of mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, has become interrupted by cascading disasters, where you see changes in human processes, anthropogenic-driven changes in the environment due to climate change or other changes like human changes on the landscape, and reduce capacity after the disaster, where the recovery phase is never truly completed. And when I spoke earlier about the poverty trap and all that, there was, maybe not purposely, but there was this mindset between low-income countries and high-income countries, where we traditionally thought, in the US and other parts of the world, high income, we actually complete the recovery phase. And now there's a realization that that's not necessarily true with cascading events. So the secondary disaster has a disproportionate impact. So not the multi-hazard extremes like I was showing, where 2 things occur, 3 things occur on the same day, but just the sequence of things. And this paper from Gill and I'm not sure how the last name's pronounced, but Mahmoud, shows this sequence event, and they've got it's a pretty good summary of this phenomenon. Shows lots of different ways of looking at disaster interactions between technological disasters and natural disasters. Although literature's moved away from using natural disaster as a term and just refers to disasters, but I think it's still useful to differentiate the technological from the non. So if we look for examples of this, there's one that comes to mind for me because this happened in my hometown long before I was born, but in 1917, there was an explosion of a French munition ship collided with a Belgian relief vessel in the narrowest part of a harbor in Halifax in Nova Scotia, Canada, where I grew up. And the neighborhood actually where my father grew up, but before his time as well, was destroyed by the explosion. The ship caught fire, drifted to a pier, and then exploded. The crew had abandoned the ship because they knew what was stored on it. There was Benzoyl on the deck and gun cotton underneath, and it was just loaded with munitions in a way that probably wouldn't happen today, of course. But the disaster was, overwhelming just in the magnitude of it. The explosion broke windows 100 kilometers away, and there was people killed instantly, of course. And most of the fire department had, the downtown fire department, including the one motor-driven water pump that they had, responded to the fire and was destroyed in the explosion. So, wartime, a munition ship exploding, it's not unheard of event. Or, you could compare it to the grain elevator explosion in Beirut. Things like this occur, and they've got a probability. But when you combine it with the blizzard, which is not an uncommon occurrence in Nova Scotia in December, that happened the next day, it really interfered with the response. So the response back then, no surprise, was by train. There was trains coming from Montreal and from New England, specifically Boston sent up a lot of relief effort. In fact, they were the first train to get through the snowdrifts and get to Halifax outside of local trains. So they had to call off the search because of the 16 inches, 40 centimeters of snow that fell on the day after the disaster. And it blocked some of the trains for days from getting up there. But if you consider this is, I think, the classic look at cascading disasters. You've got a disaster that occurs, technological in this case, and then a normal natural event that's well within capacity at any other time. But given the disaster scenario was really worsened the effect. And if we look at increasing frequencies of weather-related events due to climate change, or reduced capacity because of the frequency of these events, you can see this problem being perhaps more likely, whether it's a natural disaster or a technological disaster followed by a weather event, or during a weather event that normally would be within capacity is now pushed outside of capacity. So a heat wave following an event that causes a power outage, for instance, like I mentioned, the Beirut explosion. It's not uncommon to have a heat wave in Beirut in August, right? So with the power outage, you could see people suffering. In fact, reliable electrical network is a problem in Beirut normally, and people suffer due to heat waves. And then there's plans that have generally not been adapted to pandemic conditions. So if you look at, there was an example from the US about what to do with communal shelters after tornadoes. There's a tornado impact, and the norm is for people to get together. So in 2021, what do we do with these communal shelters where COVID transmission could be increased? And there's a good report from FEMA on supplemental planning considerations. But another example would be a flood in New York with evacuation plans that has people gathering in high schools, being bussed out on common buses. And you can adapt somewhat with PPE, but you can't totally get rid of the problem of COVID transmission or another pandemic that's communicable disease issues when you're looking at having to alter these very expensive, very logistically complicated evacuation plans, and you add the layered complexity of a pandemic, and it becomes really problematic to just change that plan in short order. So just to point to a few trends of increasing frequency from climate change, we've got persistent heat waves projected for North Africa, more common in Europe as well. And then the timing of or the increased frequency and change in timing for drought. So that points to food shortages, and then you combine it with conflict in Ukraine and the inability to ship food. And there's lots of people that know much more about that than I do, but you can see how the increased food insecurity due to climate change can really complicate things when you add in other disasters or just situations of conflict. So to shift gears a little bit and talk about data that's useful for these models and modeling, because we operate a data center for NASA, the Socioeconomic Data Application Center, and we do a lot of work on data development that's useful for these. So I'll highlight one example, population and demographic data. There's a lot of different sources for global, subnational, detailed population data, including age and sex breakdowns. But there's some limitations, what's missing. So the populations with disabilities or mobility issues, traditionally disadvantaged groups, and issues in the recency or the currency of the data, because it's often based on decennial censuses. So we've got more data than ever on population and demographic, but it does have its issues. And a lot of this can be supplemented with survey data, which is sort of the gold standard for more recent, more detailed variables, but geographically, it's often less representative, less detailed geographically, and very heterogeneous, and a lot of work to put it together into a globally consistent data set. So we've coordinate an initiative called the PopGrid Data Collaborative, which is a data collaborative aimed at coordinating different groups that do population and infrastructure data modeling. And we've met several times and shared data. And one of the things we've created is this population intercomparison tool, which is linked via the logo, that lets you look at different population data sets and see what the estimates are for a particular area. Or for example, to look at, here we've got our pop estimation tool that lets you look at not just broad, but detailed 5-year age categories for any part of the global surface. Economic and inequality data. There's, for several decades now, been different academics and different groups that have done global gridded GDP surfaces. So just the dollars per pixel in terms of national output that are disaggregated, typically based on satellite night lights data, economic models, and population. And so I've got some links to some recent surfaces. So the Wang and Sun GDP estimates came out in May this year, so very recent release. But I think more relevant are more sophisticated looks now. Our traditional hotspots approach, where you're just using dollars, I think it's more relevant to look at things like the Human Development Index or poverty measures and correlates like infant mortality rates, underweight children. And on the right, you see a relatively new surface developed by Facebook or Meta's Data for Good initiative that gets you a very detailed relative wealth index. So we see part of South Africa with a very zoomed in look at Johannesburg, detailed gridded look at the relative wealth index. And this is available for all low and middle income countries in the world. And then I wanted to just a plug for our own surface, which is coming out this month, actually. We've got a relative deprivation index that we've developed, and it is, again, a gridded surface that's similar to the wealth index, but it includes more factors in its consideration. And infrastructure data. So we've seen the release now of global automatically derived building footprints. Google has open buildings for Africa, which are more detailed than the Microsoft data because they're based on more detailed imagery. There's long been OpenStreetMap. But what's missing from these data are key attributes, the number of stories, the construction type, lots of detail that's relevant for hazard modeling. So we can count the number of buildings and maybe do a better pop estimate, but we have no idea on the vulnerability of those buildings. So we've got some ongoing efforts to improve the attribution of those buildings in collaboration with commercial partners and other research groups. On the left is a sample and mechanical Turk approach we're using to estimate different characteristics for flood vulnerability for buildings in Peru. And so we're looking at sampling at the neighborhood level using Street View, these different characteristics that are useful for flooding and trying to produce new open data sets that are useful for that. And that segues into our ongoing and future work. We're still working on population modeling. We're involved in 3 different global population data sets that are being updated. We're working on a new economic surface model, so another look at gridded GDP, but that breaks things out by sector. So you can look at business interruption or sectoral impacts. And then we've long wanted to go back and revisit our global hotspots analysis with updated hazard data as well as updated methods. And now, of course, considering whether we want to look at cascading impact analysis and multiple events. So happy to take questions offline, but also when we get to the broader discussion, but there's my contact info again. So thanks for your time.
Thanks, Greg. That was wonderful. Yeah, I hadn't even heard of the Halifax disaster, and I grew up in not that far away in the Northeast US. So yeah, I think that kind of speaks to some of the issues that you talked about. Does anyone have a question for Greg at this time? We can also have a little more full discussion after Anaïs's talk. Yeah, I had a few thoughts, but I'll save them for the fuller discussion. Okay, so in that case, we will move ahead to Anaïs's talk, and to start it off, we're actually going to do a one question, multiple choice
yes.
survey poll. Go
I'll
ahead.
share my screen so you can get the codes, and then I'll need to share another.
Oh, I see. Okay, so we both. That's funny. Oh, sorry. We both made a Mentimeter. It's basically the
Did
same
you make
thing.
one? Oh, so then
Yeah. Okay, that's funny.
I'll unshare my screen. Though.
Sorry, I went and
Let's
copied it in the chat just like a second before you said. Okay, yeah.
Let's use yours. Sorry about
Okay.
that. So then I'll check.
Okay,
I'll
hopefully.
answer myself as well.
Yeah. Okay, so hopefully it is what you imagine. So let's see. All right. So what you do is everybody, you either click on the link in the chat or just look at this. Okay, so it looks like you're already doing it. So that's great. Yeah, you can go to menti.com and just enter that code. Yeah, I didn't put an other, so if you think it's something else, just put which of those 3, I guess, is the
Mine was open,
yeah.
so yeah.
Is
But,
it, oh, yours is going to be a
your
word cloud
discussion,
thing?
it's good.
Okay, yeah. Competing Mentimeters, yeah, how often does that happen? Yeah, so a lot of yeah, not a lot of physical knowledge advocates here, and kind of sort of a tie between the impacts data and the governance, and there's a correlated, places with low governance, I guess, also have challenges with social and impacts data. Okay, yeah. So hopefully that sparks something, and then we'll turn to Anaïs's talk. I will stop my sharing then.
Yeah, so maybe I can, and I'll start sharing my screen already. Share screen. That's this one I need to share. And then if I do this, it should work. Yes.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Perfect. Yeah, so the reason why this Mentimeter that I thought was really interesting is one thing I've learned throughout the last years of research is that, we scientists spend a lot of time looking more on the hazard part, the quantification and the data. And yet when we ask to other stakeholders or decision makers, why are we still seeing those disasters happening? Well, often it's because of other reasons. That being said, I mean, I'm not. I wish I would say I would be an expert in governments and social data, but I'm not. So that's not really what I will be completely talking about. But I tried to make this presentation quite broad in the overview. So actually, I left the title because it was also quite general, and I liked that part. So I'll be talking about addressing challenges in multi-hazard decision making with modeling and risk simulation game So not on the decision-making process itself, but rather, which information can we provide to help this decision maker? And maybe that's one way we as scientists should start building our science. So really actionable information. And so maybe before I start, just a little bit about myself. So I'm finishing a PhD student at the IVM, the Institute for Environmental Studies. And 2 months ago, I also started as a consultant in Deltares, which is applied research institute in the world of water and any type of water when we think. So it could be droughts, floods, water resources management, etc. And the picture you see behind is actually flooding that happened in the UK and Ireland due to Storm Ciara. I don't know if I said it correctly, in February 2020. And of course, I mean, most of my PhD has been on flooding, so I thought it would be nice to put this picture, but I also thought it was interesting to reflect a bit about this event as an introduction for this theme. So even though this event is on multi-hazard, if we look at the event itself, most of the damage was not only because of the rainfall, but also because of the wind. So already when we're thinking about, a type of hazard, it clearly has different multivariate drivers. So that's already one aspect of those multi-hazard component. The second interesting thing of this this event is that a week later, it was followed by Storm Dennis. And it impacted a lot of the, so here I just took from, I forgot the references, but I took those figures from Wikipedia. And you see that it followed quite similar tracks. So you can already start thinking, and that was a very great introduction by Greg, actually, a lot of things I will be talking about this, how this vulnerability is changing. So, but already thinking from the hazard part, the question is, are we capturing those dynamics? And so in the last years, there's been really a lot of different groups coming up to similar conclusions, whether from the compound extremes, so looking at those temporal and spatial interactions, but also from the multi-hazard methodology, so looking at those cascading events. And I think we're slowly converging towards those methodologies. So for this presentation, like I said, I'm not an expert on governance or on decision-making processes themselves, but I wanted to touch upon those facts in the sense, which information can we provide that can help support decision, or are we still missing important points? And so I wanted to give 3 different examples based on the research that with people I've collaborated with or done myself, looking into this. So giving 3 different perspectives, one from the compound flooding, one from reported events, so events that have happened, and again, very similar to Greg, I'll be actually picking one of those examples he mentioned, and one from the risk practitioners, and then this was done with the serious game. I'll be quite brief for the sake of time, but I'm happy to have longer discussions afterwards. So first, looking from a compound flooding perspective, so the example I wanted to put here is a study that we've done on Ho Chi Minh City, which is the picture you see here. The very interesting part about Ho Chi Minh City is that it's affected by very different flooding hazards that have very different temporalities. So I put some screenshots here of flood events that have happened. So for example, because of high tides, that could also be due because of high storm surge events on top of those high tides, on tropical cyclones. So even though in south of the country, there's still some famous tropical cyclones or typhoon that have impacted the region, like Typhoon Minda. And you have very strong rainfall events, mainly related to the monsoon that happens there. So if we look at those drivers, basically looking at those different flood hazards, you will see that, and that's what you see on this picture, and that have very strong seasonality in them. And that means that for this location, we really cannot pick, for example, an annual maxima, because we would basically be missing other important events that may happen at other different times. So the whole point of this study was to develop a flexible flood risk assessment framework that would look at different hazards. And that was done in three different components. First, assessing those flood drivers that I just showed in the previous slide, trying to quantify their interactions statistically, so through this multivariate distribution, and then trying to assess as quickly as possible the expected damage. And that's because if we're looking into risk, so expected monthly or annual damage, we need to run a lot of different combinations. And in this case, running this hydrodynamic model took a lot of time. So we sort of made a shortcut, and I'll explain that in the next slide, and did a really simple driver to response surface. So I won't go into detail into those components, but like I said, we take, in this case, it was observed time series because we're lucky enough to have observations. And then we quantify their multivariate joint distribution per month. And so in this way, we capture some of the seasonality in those drivers and their potential dependence, even though I must say already that for this location, because of the observation, the dependence was not as strong, and because we were already looking at a monthly timescale. And then with our response surface curve, we can model this damage. And so what it would look like is that basically we try to model different combination of rainfall and sea level, which what you see on the X and Y axis. For example, here I pick 2 points. And then with the hydrodynamic simulation, look what is the expected damage that we would have for this event. And that means that we run this hydrodynamic model from which we extract the maximum water depth, and then we combine this with exposure and vulnerability data, so the land cover and the depth damage curve, to get the damage. And we basically repeated that for different combinations of those drivers. And so that means that once we have our multivariate joint distribution, we can now sample this surface, because our multivariate distribution is a function of the rainfall and the sea level. And we basically now just have a surface that's from which we can sample from the expected damage. So basically, with this monthly known distribution, we do a lot of different sampling. And so what do we get from it? So it's a lot of information. I just want to focus basically on the black box plots and the red one, which are the let's say not the two most extremes. Actually, the black one is from the modeled, so what we get from the observations, and the red one is actually assuming full dependence between the drivers. So the main takeaway from these figures is that what I thought was very interesting. First, you find again this seasonal signal of what we could see in the drivers, but it is being modulated by this exposure and vulnerability. So because not all the damage happens at the same location within the region. So for example, the coastal damage is very different than the rainfall damage. This is why you don't see a one-to-one correspondence. So I thought that was interesting. And the second thing is it's very interesting to see that there is a lot of, that this risk is spread throughout the year. So again, that brings back the point that if we don't capture this correct seasonality, then we will not capture damage correctly. And so in that sense, for this location, a study only based on one driver and selecting annual maxima would miss some of the damage. So this seasonal risk is really important. And also because damage could happen already at a very low return period, it was even more important to capture basically this part of the distribution. So that's what I mean by this level of protection will dictate where most of the expected damage lies. So I think we're very used to make studies for which we have very high level of protection. And so then those very, very extreme events relatively influence highly the expected annual damage. But in a location where we don't have high protection standards, then actually those low events, because they're happening very often, can sum up quite quickly. So that was also interesting. Yeah, and we need flexible dependence framework because we need to be able to account for those different flood hazards. So yeah, this was only looking at flood hazards, but then multiple different flood hazards. In the next studies, the point was, can we actually not, we wanted to look at different combination of let's say, those geophysical hazards and disaster types. And the discussion started actually also looking at the Pinatubo disaster. So that was a very great introduction from Greg once again. This picture here is not from Pinatubo because, but if you look at the picture, it looks as impressive as this. And that's later led to a very interesting paper led by Marlene de Ruiter on the whole concept of consecutive disasters. But for this case study, we were basically looking at Pinatubo, which is in the Botalam-Barangay district, which is an administrative level. So that's where this arrow is pointing. And you can see on the left, well, it's, of course, there is a volcano there, but you can also see the tropical cyclone tracks on the left. And the points is the magnitude of the earthquakes that have happened over some historic period. So yeah, clearly the Philippines is exposed to a lot of different hazards. And so when we focus on this, well, this little black region, so the administrative level I just put before, and we look at the data that we collected, that we extracted from this location, this is what you would be able to see. So this sort of code bar, I always call them, of when events happen. So you see that indeed those typhoons happen quite regularly, and that's in a way to be expected. You can see a series of floods happening. You can see earthquake, and the very interesting part, and that's exactly what Greg was mentioning. When this volcanic eruption happened for Pinatubo, it happened to coincide as well with the Typhoon Yunya, I think. And well, the earthquake then, of course, is very closely related in terms of causal mechanism with the volcanic eruption. But the typhoon itself was mainly due to seasonality. So basically, it happened at the wrong time, or wrong time, wrong place. But this is really a key point here, is that most of the time those relationships are studied because there is some sort of causal mechanism. But we also need to take into account the fact that because you're in certain environment, you are being exposed to other hazards that will happen because they are in a certain climate, just like this typhoon here. So the point from this was, can we try to reproduce, so with this data, can we try to reproduce, take the information of those frequencies and how often they're happening, and try to generate combinations of events based on this. So I didn't put a slide on the method here because I wanted to focus on the representation of this. But if you have questions, you can ask me. And so once we have basically those, and so by doing this, what we did is we basically extended the record of those 30 or 40 years time series we had to very long synthetic time series, which means that then we could start calculating probabilities. For example, in this case, looking what is the probability that I have at least one event, so that's on the row, at least one event within my year. And this probability is very high because it's not so hard to convince if you've seen the previous slides that there is at least one event happening. And you can start doing those calculations for a whole different type of combination of time windows and of number of events. So again, if I just look 1 year from when a given event happened, what was the chance that you had at least 5 events happening? And then the more events you add, the more unlikely it becomes. And similarly, the shorter you look from when an event has just happened, the more unlikely it's become. But the interesting point about this is that it basically gives a signature of how events are happening at a given location. It also provides some valuable information about the time window and the probability before you have another event. And so in this case, we don't discriminate between any type of event. The point was just to make a first statement about this, right? And this time window is often very important, looking into the disaster risk management cycle, which again, Greg introduced very well. So yeah, I think with those type of tools, we can start looking very much differently into preparing for hazards, and not only from the causal mechanism, but also from the sheer fact that if this would happen in winter, then it's also very likely that you would have, for example, this blizzard or snow event happening. This was only looking at Pinatubo, but so my colleague Marlene de Ruiter then led this study looking more globally about other occurrences of those events. And this is not something, this is something we can expect across the globe. It only depends on which type of hazards you're looking into, but those relationship between whether there is a causal mechanism or whether there is not, whether those events are independent, that's been observed pretty much everywhere. And to make the point, we also calculated, for example, here we just look at tropical cyclone and earthquake interactions, again, based on those global data sets. On the top, you see basically the relative frequency with the time window. I didn't put it here, but it's with a short time window, which I think is a few days, and below, I think 1 month or a few months. And so then you can basically start quantifying those type of relationship and provide this information to risk managers. And the last example I wanted to show was, well, trying to reproduce this setting in a game environment, so in a serious game. And of course, it's a very big simplification. And so this was done by developing this game, which is called the Breaking the Silos. And again, it's been led by my colleague Marlene de Ruiter, who now published about this. So this is, the figures are taken from the article. But the main point between Breaking the Silos is it's a collaborative game where we can be up to 8 players. I think it's the number of players that can be around it. And it basically recreates, it's a fictitious island that can be impacted by different disasters. So drought, tropical cyclones, and floods of different intensities. And basically, the whole objective is that you have to protect as best as possible your island. And so this is basically some sort of objectives have to be met. So trying to have as less people impacted as possible from an event, but also trying to keep your critical infrastructure. And of course, you have a limited budget to do that. And so the difference with some other games that exist, or what is interesting, is that the action starts after the event happens, which is actually often what we see in those traditional response of a disaster, that we start thinking about what should be done after, well, when it's too late, and based on that, try to look for the future. The whole point is that the team has to work together, and it's supposed to represent different key stakeholders within the disaster response action. So there is a president, a minister of finance, and then a drought expert, a flood expert, also someone for aid, an agriculture expert. But the information is not shared, so they really have to discuss. And in this role, the moderator should be as absent as possible. So the point is that those interactions are described in the role card they get. But in the end, it's up to them to share the information. And I mean, of course, they are encouraged because they want to help the country as well. And so the picture you see on the right here, it's very interesting because it's for the same sequence of, so the sequence of disaster is randomly selected at the beginning of the game. So it's just a simple random generator between 1 to 3 to say which hazard will happen every round, and then to say the intensity. And then based on this, we basically have vulnerability. So we have vulnerability response that will adapt based on the intensity. And then there are 3 rounds, and at the end of each round, the team decides the set of actions they want to do. And then the second disaster will happen. And then you see, well, whether, but of course they don't know where it will happen and what it will be. Only the moderator knows, which should not interact. And so the point in the end is to reflect on this. And so this figure on the right of the slide is interesting because it shows it's the same set of disasters with the same, so the whole storyline is the same, but you can see that each team comes with very different, with very different narrative and options. And in the feedback we got when playing the game, I think it was nice to see that people enjoyed playing the game. I think the most interesting answers was on the realistic part. I think they were quite, you can see that. So basically you see the average grade, but you also see the distribution from it. And so whether this was realistic had quite a broad range of answers. And of course it is much more simple than how these actions happen. And the other point I thought was interesting was whether this would lead to feature action, which got a lower score. So here again, it shows that, of course, this is only a game, but creating change is something that takes long and will need to happen in other ways as well. So that's one way to help raise awareness about this, but there is more that needs to happen. Oh, and yeah, you can play it yourself. On the paper, we show the link where you can. It's very simple. It's you can download it. You don't need any special thing. So as a summary, wrapping up with those 3 different perspectives I've given based on compound flooding, on reported events, and on the serious game, I hope I could convince you that those separate hazard analysis is a simplification that we know already, but to be able to capture those impacts is often incorrect. And when we mean multi-hazard, for me, it could be already within a given hazard category with those different flood drivers or drivers interacting, or within this different temporal sequence. That makes it itself also a multivariate problem. That it is important to select the relevant time scale and their interactions, time and spatial scale, which I did not discuss here because I was mainly focusing on the time scale. And that while dependence and independence should be considered. And that communication and multi-sectoral collaboration is key. So that was encapsulated within the game. So that's a nice summary. I think from my own reflection, even though data is becoming more and more available, there's still remaining data gaps that exist. The hard part is to have very consistent data time series in time and space. So I think that was already interesting from Greg's presentation. We could see that the data is given, for example, every 5 years, whereas often, climate data is given as a much higher resolution. 5 years is already quite nice, don't get me wrong, but the point is there may be even bigger gaps in time and space to be able to have a comprehensive picture. Most of those examples were based on observations, and in places, for example, especially looking at tropical cyclones, where we have so few occurrences, it makes their quantification very difficult, both in understanding their impact, but in trying to understand the relationship to those flood drivers. So based on this, synthetic modeling could be a very interesting way forward to put into the multi-hazard risk frameworks. I just discussed mainly on the hazard parts, but I think thinking about those easy wins. So what I mean by multi-hazard resilience is most of the time simple actions can actually bring a lot of resilience within your systems. And that should be further explored. And it's the more variables, the more hazards you want to consider, the more time scales you want to consider. We basically need quite flexible framework, but also it will need a lot of, it will definitely create a lot of computational challenges. So how do we deal with this? I think that's more for the scientific community. With this, I would like, oh, and yes, I wanted to highlight one of the recent projects that are being led by colleagues at the VU, so Professor Philip Ward and Marlene de Ruiter, who are working on a project. So I put the website here, myriadproject.eu, basically looking into those themes and trying to remove those remove those knowledge gaps.
And we may have a talk about that coming up in the fall as well.
Great.
To be determined. Yeah.
Perfect. So yeah, I would like to thank you for listening, and a big thank you to all my co-authors and people I've worked with from the VU and other universities.
Thanks, Anaïs. Yeah, that was really great, and I thought that was a pretty comprehensive survey of some of those issues related to the different aspects of hydrological risk and geophysical risk in general, and very creative.